Our presentation examines the role of immigrants in Japan and how they are perceived by Japanese people. Our research is divided into 3 parts. First, we discuss how immigrants and foreigners are perceived in Japanese society. Although Japan needs immigrants to sustain its workforce, as a result of population decline, many Japanese people do not have positive feelings about immigration. Japan's population is largely homogeneous, and the country's collectivist culture encourages everyone to look and act the same. Individuality is not considered a positive trait, and society encourages fitting in as much as possible. In fact, many Japanese people are worried that foreigners won't adhere to the traditional way of life because they are different. These beliefs about differences may stem from a psychological phenomenon. An in-group is a group with which someone identifies as, whereas an in-group is a group with which someone does not identify. Additionally, in-group favoritism is a naturally occurring tendency where people evaluate favorably and privilege in-group members more than out-group members, which contributes to existing divides in communities. Views on immigration to Japan among Japanese people are slowly changing, but there are still many negative stereotypes associated with foreigners. When Japanese citizens were asked about immigration, only 23% believed the Japanese government should allow more immigrants to move to their country. Furthermore, many Japanese people believe immigration increases the risk of terrorism in Japan and think immigrants are more likely to break the law. One reason why foreigners may be perceived negatively in Japan is their small number and therefore lack of contact with Japanese people. When people do not have the opportunity to develop a relationship with those who are different from them, it can cause a lack of understanding that leads to a lack of connection and a sense of otherness. As immigration rates to Japan rise, perceptions towards all kinds of people who are not Japanese will hopefully slowly become more positive.
The next topic we examine is the current population crisis in Japan. Japan has the oldest population in the world and one of the lowest fertility rates in the world at 1.43 births per woman. Japan's current population of around 127 million people is expected to contract by 30% by 2065, when 38% of Japanese people will be 65 or older. This is important because a higher elderly population increases the cost of Social Security and healthcare benefits, while a shrinking workforce means that production will stagnate and the tax base will be smaller. On its current trajectory, Japan's elderly will likely not be able to receive proper care, and the workforce of Japan will be overwhelmed trying to support it. There are many reasons for why Japanese people are having so few children. One of the biggest is economic insecurity among young people, especially young men. Japan's employment structure has been shifting so that fewer and fewer young people have regular employment, and because Japanese culture still puts a burden on men being the breadwinners and single-handedly supporting their families, many people conclude that they are simply not financially stable enough to start a family. Furthermore, even those who are fortunate enough to have regular employment often do not have the time or energy to date, marry, or start a family. Japanese people who work some of the longest hours in the world and have some of the lowest rates of used vacation days. This is in large part due to Japan's extremely intense work culture that shames workers for not working as hard as possible. It can often be considered rude to clock out before your boss, and taking vacation days is often considered burdening other employees. The result of all of this is that even those who earn enough money to support a family often do not have the time or energy to date, marry, or start a family.
Lastly, Japanese immigration policy has long reflected its wish for a homogeneous society congruent with long-standing conservative political beliefs and cultural perceptions surrounding foreigners in Japanese society. And in order to understand modern Japanese immigration policy, we have to first look at their early relationship with foreigners immigrating to Japan. In the time before and during World War II, Korea was colonized by Japan, and millions of Koreans were given Japanese citizenship and then were forced to immigrate to Japan to fill the shortage of manual laborers. After the Allies defeated Japan in World War II, many Koreans chose to return to Korea, but millions decided to stay in Japan. Within the remaining Korean community in Japan, the communist ideology spread, which the United States, an allied country, didn't support, so they pushed restrictive immigration policy which stripped Koreans of their Japanese citizenship. Modern-day immigration policy is not far from what it was post-World War II. This was highlighted by the Syrian refugee crisis in the mid-2010s, when former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe opted to only give monetary support to the United Nations rather than opening their borders to more than the 100 Syrian refugees they granted asylum to. The resistance to radically expanding Japanese immigration policy is largely a political issue, as the Japanese are fairly conservative in their voting. However, the newly elected Prime Minister of Japan, Yoshihide Suga, is a supporter of the 2018 Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act amendment that created 345,000 new visas for lower-skilled workers. While this is still only a small portion of the immigration policy expansion that needs to be done in Japan, it is a step in the right direction and reflective of the slowly evolving public perception of immigrants. In conclusion, while there is no easy solution to Japan's population crisis, there are many things that the Japanese government can do. First, it must address its shifting employment structure and its stressful workplace environment, and strive to provide young Japanese people the time, money, and energy to start families. More importantly, however, Japan must acknowledge that it must become a more welcoming place for foreigners. The Japanese government can do this by relaxing their strict immigration restrictions, which would help normalize foreigners in the eyes of the Japanese people. It can also provide Japanese language courses for those who need them and change its visa application process to be simpler and allow for longer stays. The solution to Japan's population crisis is no easy one. However, if Japan wishes to remain relevant in an ever-globalizing world, it must be willing to make changes that go against what it has historically done, even if the public disagrees.